Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the American West. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1868. The Civil War had ended just 3 years prior, and the nation was still nursing its wounds. Colorado Territory was a rugged expanse of untamed wilderness and small settlements, not yet granted statehood. The western frontier represented both opportunity and peril for those brave or desperate enough to venture there. It is within this backdrop that our account takes place. A dark chapter that few history books mention, yet continues to cast a long shadow over a remote corner of Colorado's San Luis Valley. When travelers passed through the small settlement of Conejos in the southern part of the territory, they would often hear hushed warnings about a location roughly 6 miles east of town, near the foothills where the valley floor begins its gentle ascent toward the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The Sisters' Well, locals called it, though no signpost marked its presence, and many denied knowledge of it when pressed by outsiders. Those who acknowledged its existence spoke in lowered voices, their eyes darting to ensure no unwelcome ears were listening. The first documented mention of what would later become known as the Well of the Sisters' Bones appears in the territorial records of Colorado in March 1868, when a land surveyor named Thomas Woodward filed an unusual addendum to his official report. The addendum, discovered decades later in 1962 during the reorganization of the Colorado State Archives, had been separated from the main report and misfiled among geological surveys of the region. Woodward's notations described a circular stone structure approximately 12 feet in diameter that resembled a well, but showed no evidence of containing water. What made his report remarkable was his description of the unusual arrangement of stones and the peculiar atmospheric disturbance he experienced while attempting to measure the depth. Upon approaching within approximately 10 yards of the structure, Woodward wrote, "I experienced a sensation not unlike the pressure change one feels when descending rapidly from high elevation. This was accompanied by a subtle but persistent ringing in the ears, which made concentration difficult." Holloway reported similar discomfort, adding that he believed he could discern voices carried on the wind, though I myself heard nothing of the sort. What Woodward couldn't have known as he made his careful measurements that crisp March morning was that he had stumbled upon what would become the focal point of one of the most disturbing mysteries in Colorado's territorial history. A mystery that would claim at least 7 lives over the next 18 months and leave an indelible mark on the region's collective memory. My assistant, Mr. Duh. The story truly begins, however, not with Woodward's discovery, but nearly a decade earlier, with the arrival of the Blackwood sisters to the San Luis Valley in 1859. Constance and Millicent Blackwood had journeyed west from Philadelphia following the death of their father, a prosperous merchant whose business collapsed in the financial panic of 1857. According to probate records in Philadelphia, examined by researchers in 1952, the sisters were the sole heirs to what remained of their father's estate, a sum insufficient to maintain their previous lifestyle in the East, but substantial enough to establish themselves modestly in the less expensive Western territories. The sisters, unmarried and in their early 30s, arrived in Colorado with modest funds, but considerable determination. According to town records in Conejos, they purchased a small parcel of land on the eastern outskirts of the settlement, near where the well would later be discovered. The purchase was finalized on September 17, 1859, and recorded in the name of Constance Blackwood only, a detail that would later be noted by investigators as unusual, given that both sisters contributed to the purchase price. The Blackwood sisters kept largely to themselves. Constance, the elder by 2 years, occasionally ventured into town to sell herbal remedies and tinctures, which she claimed were formulated from native plants she gathered in the foothills. She was described in contemporary accounts as tall and straight-backed, with dark hair pulled severely away from a face that, while not conventionally beautiful, possessed a compelling intensity. Those who dealt with her in business matters found her knowledgeable and precise, if somewhat reserved. Millicent was rarely seen, though those who did encounter her described her as quiet and watchful, with unusually pale eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything in return. Unlike her sister, who dressed in the practical but respectable fashion of a middle-class Eastern woman, Millicent reportedly favored darker clothing and was often seen with a black shawl draped over her head, regardless of the weather. One account from the journal of the local schoolteacher described her as having the demeanor of one accustomed to sick rooms and loss, a woman who has made her peace with shadows. What we know of the sisters comes primarily from the journal of Abigail Thornton, the wife of the local mercantile owner, who maintained a detailed account of daily life in Conejos from 1858 until her death in 1866. Her descriptions of the Blackwoods are sparse but telling. On April 17, 1860, she wrote, "Miss C. Blackwood came for supplies today, purchased salt, coffee, and 2 yards of black ribbon, inquired about sending a letter east, but declined when told the postage cost. Something in her manner suggests a woman carrying a burden heavier than her frame should bear. When I inquired after her sister's health, she replied only that Millicent finds the mountain air beneficial for her condition, though what ailment she suffers from, Miss Blackwood did not elaborate." A subsequent entry, dated July 3, 1860, provides additional insight. Encountered both Blackwood sisters at the Independence Day preparations. Miss Constance contributed a surprisingly delicious elderberry cordial to the community table. The younger sister, Millicent, spoke little, but observed much. I noted her making detailed sketches in a small book, drawings of the mountain range as seen from town, rendered with remarkable precision. When I complimented her skill, she closed the book abruptly and remarked that some shapes reveal themselves only when properly framed, an odd statement that lingered with me. The sisters' home, according to the few accounts that exist, was a modest cabin constructed of local timber and stone. What set it apart, however, was the carefully tended garden that surrounded it on 3 sides. Even during the harsh winter months, when most of the valley lay dormant under snow, visitors reported that certain plants in the Blackwoods garden remained green and vibrant. This peculiarity became the subject of local speculation, with some attributing it to the sisters' knowledge of Eastern horticultural techniques, while others whispered of more unnatural explanations. A traveling botanist who visited the region in the summer of 1861, Dr. William Forster, made note of the unusual flora surrounding the Blackwood property. In a letter to a colleague at Harvard, preserved in the university's archives, he wrote, "Most remarkable is their cultivation of several species I believed incapable of surviving at this elevation and in this climate. Of particular interest is a variant of datura, which thrives in their garden despite the frost." When I inquired as to their methods, Miss Constance Blackwood spoke of feeding the roots with proper nourishment, but declined to elaborate on the composition of the soil. I was not permitted to take samples. By 1862, the sisters had established a routine of sorts within the community. Constance would appear in town every second Tuesday, selling her remedies from a small table outside the mercantile. Her concoctions gained a reputation for effectiveness, particularly her nerve tonic, which many claimed could cure everything from insomnia to female complaints. The territorial doctor, when passing through, reportedly scoffed at such folk medicines, but even he conceded that some of Constance's herbal knowledge appeared scientifically sound. A receipt book kept by the mercantile, examined decades later by historians, shows regular purchases by Constance Blackwood that offer some insight into their lives. Unusual quantities of salt, various metal implements, glass containers, specialized herbs not native to the region, and, perhaps most curiously, several orders for specialized books on mineralogy and ancient languages shipped from Denver at considerable expense. What changed this established pattern remains a matter of speculation, but records indicate that in late August of 1862, the sisters abruptly ceased their ventures into town. When questioned, locals would later tell investigators that a dispute had arisen regarding the ownership of certain lands east of the sisters' property, lands that Constance had apparently been using to gather her herbs. The dispute involved a man named Jeremiah Holt, who had recently arrived from Kansas with plans to establish a cattle operation in the valley. Holt, according to county records, had purchased a substantial tract of land that included a portion of the foothills where Constance collected her botanicals. A confrontation between Holt and Constance was witnessed by several townspeople on August 27, 1862. According to their accounts recorded in the sheriff's log, Holt accused Constance of trespassing and threatened to have her arrested if she continued to venture onto his property. Constance reportedly responded with unusual vehemence, claiming that the land in question belonged to forces older than his paper deed, and warning that some boundaries should not be marked by mortal men. Holt's arrival coincides with the first mention of unusual activities at the Blackwood property. A cattle driver named Samuel Pierce, employed by Holt, reported to the local sheriff that while tracking stray cattle near the Blackwood land in September 1862, he observed the sisters engaged in what he described as unwholesome work in the eastern section of their property. According to the sheriff's log, preserved in the Conejos County Historical Society archives, Pierce claimed to have seen the women digging a large circular pit by moonlight, working with methodical precision despite the late hour. Pierce's account continues. They had lanterns placed at the cardinal points around the excavation, casting their shadows long across the ground. The older one, Constance, was reading from a book while the younger sister dug. What struck me as peculiar was the silence. No words passed between them that I could hear, yet they worked as if following some predetermined plan. When the younger one struck something solid with her shovel, both women knelt at the edge of the pit and began clearing dirt with their hands. I could not see what they uncovered, but their manner changed. A kind of reverence entered their movements. It was then that the wind shifted, carrying their voices to where I hid. The older one said something that sounded like, "The aperture is intact," and the younger replied, "We can resume the correspondence." I departed shortly thereafter, unsettled by what I had witnessed. When questioned further, Pierce admitted to having consumed a considerable quantity of whiskey that evening, and his account was largely dismissed by the sheriff, who noted in his log that Pierce had a known tendency toward embellishment, and had previously reported seeing mountain lions of extraordinary size near his campsite. Over the next 3 years, the sisters retreated further from community life. Sightings became increasingly rare, though occasional smoke from their chimney confirmed their continued presence. Their purchases from the mercantile became less frequent and were often made through intermediaries, local youths who were paid to deliver goods in exchange for small vials of Constance's remedies, or occasionally silver coins of Eastern mint. These accounts, collected years later by Professor Edward Harrington of Denver University for his 1937 monograph on frontier folklore, described sensations of unexplained dread, disorientation, and in some cases, auditory hallucinations described as women's voices engaged in argument or lamentation. One such account, provided by a mail carrier named Frederick Chambers, who regularly traveled the route past the Blackwood property, is particularly detailed. It was always the same stretch of road about a quarter-mile east of their cabin where the feeling would come over me. During this period, travelers began to report strange experiences when passing near the eastern boundary of the Blackwood property. A heaviness in the air, like just before a thunderstorm, but without any clouds. My horse felt it too, would get skittish, ears flicking back and forth. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like women talking, though the words weren't clear. Reminded me of standing outside a room where people are having a conversation. You can hear the rhythm of speech, but not make out what's being said. Once, in the winter of '64, I distinctly heard someone call my name, clear as day. Spooked me so badly, I took the long route around for a month after. It was in April of 1865, as the nation reeled from Lincoln's assassination, that the first documented disappearance occurred. Martin Weaver, a tinker traveling the territory, was last seen heading east from Conejos toward the pass that would take him to the next settlement. When he failed to arrive at his destination, a search party was organized. They found his wagon abandoned approximately half a mile from the Blackwood property. His personal effects remained untouched, suggesting robbery was not the motive. His tools were laid out in an orderly fashion beside the wagon, as if he had stopped to make repairs, but there was no sign of damage to the vehicle. Most peculiar was the discovery of Weaver's hat, placed precisely in the center of the road, weighted down with a smooth river stone that was not native to the immediate area. The sheriff's report, filed on April 22, 1865, makes brief mention of an interview with Constance Blackwood, who claimed to have neither seen nor heard anything unusual on the day of Weaver's disappearance. The report notes that Millicent was indisposed and unable to answer questions, though a deputy reported seeing a figure watching from an upstairs window throughout the interview. What the sheriff's report fails to mention, but was later revealed in his personal diary, discovered in 1945 during the renovation of the old Conejos courthouse, was his observation that Constance Blackwood appeared unusually vital during their interview, with a high color in her cheeks and a brightness to her eyes that suggested recent excitement or exertion. He also noted that when he inquired about a smudge of what appeared to be clay on her sleeve, she explained it away as residue from her gardening work, though the color and consistency, he wrote, more closely resembled the soil found near the foothills than the dark loam of her garden plot. It was the second disappearance, occurring in August of that same year, that began to foster suspicion among the townsfolk. No further action was taken, as disappearances on the frontier, while unfortunate, were not uncommon, and resources for extensive investigations were limited due to the ongoing war. Jacob Miller, a land surveyor employed by the territorial government, vanished while mapping the eastern portion of the valley. His equipment was discovered scattered near what would later be identified as the well site. A single page from his field journal, recovered by searchers, contained a hastily scrawled note. Structure appears man-made, circular, ancient. CB approached, claims no knowledge. Sound emanating from depth, unlike anything natural. Reminiscent of the phenomenon described by Dr. Holmwood in his accounts of the resonant chambers of Karnak, though with a quality I can only describe as organic. Will attempt closer examination after midday meal. Miller's other belongings found near the scattered equipment included his satchel containing uneaten provisions, suggesting he had not yet taken his planned meal, as well as a brass compass that, according to his assistant who remained in town during the excursion, had been in perfect working order, but was now found with its needle spinning continuously, unable to find north. The reference to CB, presumed to be Constance Blackwood, prompted the sheriff to conduct a more thorough investigation of the sisters and their property. According to his report, dated August 30, 1865, he found the Blackwood cabin in a state of peculiar orderliness. Both sisters were present and cooperative, though he noted that Millicent appeared gaunt to the point of emaciation and spoke only when directly addressed. Her hands, he observed, showed signs of recent labor, with dirt embedded under the fingernails and several fresh scratches on the palms. The sisters denied any knowledge of Miller's fate, with Constance explaining that she had indeed encountered him during her morning walk and directed him away from their property, but had not seen him after that brief interaction. When questioned about the circular structure Miller had mentioned, Constance dismissed it as likely an abandoned attempt at a well by previous settlers, and suggested that the unusual sounds Miller reported were probably mountain winds channeled through the rock formations common to the area. The investigation yielded nothing conclusive, and without evidence of wrongdoing, no charges were brought. The sheriff's diary, however, reveals his lingering concerns. I find myself troubled by certain inconsistencies in the sister's account. While Constance spoke freely, her sister's silence seemed not so much the result of natural reticence as of careful restraint. When I inquired about a locked door in the rear of the cabin, Constance explained it led to a storage area for her medicinal preparations, and that the delicate nature of certain compounds necessitated limited access. I noted, however, a distinct chill emanating from beneath the door, unusual in August, and what I believed to be the scent of excavated earth, similar to that of a freshly dug grave. By the winter of 1865, however, the mood in Conejos had shifted. Rumors circulated about the Blackwood sisters, that they practiced arcane arts brought from the East, that they conducted experiments on animals, that they had been seen conversing with something at the bottom of what was now being referred to openly as the well. These rumors might have remained just that, had it not been for the events of February 1866. According to the territorial newspaper, the Rocky Mountain News, which sent a correspondent to investigate, a severe winter storm had isolated Conejos for nearly 2 weeks. When the roads finally cleared, a peddler named Isaac Cohen made his way to town with reports of having sought shelter at the Blackwood cabin during the worst of the weather. His account, as printed in the February 27 edition, described the sisters as hospitable yet guarded. Cohen claimed to have been given a bed in the front room, but was expressly forbidden from venturing into the rear of the cabin or outside after dark. During his second night, Cohen reported hearing a rhythmic thumping from beneath the floorboards, and a woman's voice reciting what seemed verses in a language I could not identify. Cohen elaborated, "It was not Latin nor any European tongue with which I am familiar, though I speak 4 languages fluently." The cadence suggested ritual rather than conversation, a repeated phrase followed by silence, then another voice responding with a similar pattern. The curious thing was that the second voice seemed to rise from beneath the house, yet carried a quality of distance, as if traveling from much farther away. The thumping accompanied these exchanges, like a heartbeat, marking time between utterances. Most disturbing was Cohen's claim that when he rose before dawn to relieve himself and stepped outside against instructions, he observed both sisters fully dressed and heading toward the eastern edge of their property with lanterns, despite the heavy snow and bitter cold. They moved with purpose, he reported, breaking trail through snow that reached mid-thigh, yet advancing at a pace that suggested urgency. Each carried a cloth bundle cradled with noticeable care. I would have followed, but the cold was fierce, and I feared losing sight of the cabin in the darkness. When they returned approximately an hour later, their bundles were gone, and both women appeared physically depleted, as if having expended considerable energy in some labor. When he departed the next morning, Cohen reported that Constance pressed upon him a small vial of liquid, instructing him to consume it if he experienced troubling dreams in the coming nights. Cohen claimed to have discarded the vial in the snow, fearing it was poisoned. His suspicions were heightened when, upon reaching town, he discovered that his pocket watch, a gold timepiece he had carried for 20 years, had stopped precisely at 3:17 a.m., the time he estimated he had witnessed the sisters leaving the cabin, and could not be restarted. The newspaper account, sensationalized as it likely was, sparked renewed interest in the Blackwood sisters and their property. Local speculation intensified when, in March of 1866, Abigail Thornton, the mercantile owner's wife whose journal had previously documented the sisters, was found dead in her bed. The territorial doctor, summoned from Denver, attributed her death to heart failure brought on by advanced age, though Thornton was only 47. Her husband reported that in the days preceding her death, Abigail had been troubled by vivid nightmares that left her exhausted and increasingly anxious. Her final journal entry, dated the night before her death, contained a disturbing passage. I dreamt again of the well. The voices from within speak of what lies beneath our town. They know my name now. Tonight, as I wrote in this very journal, I heard scratching at the window. When I looked up, I saw her, Millicent, standing in the yard, staring at me with those pale eyes. But it was not truly her. The shape was hers, but the presence behind those eyes belonged to something else, something that has never drawn breath in our world. When I blinked, she was gone. I fear that by recording these words, I am somehow making it real, giving it substance in our realm. Perhaps that has been their purpose all along. Following Thornton's death, a delegation of town elders reportedly approached the Blackwood property with the intention of questioning the sisters about the various rumors. They found the cabin locked and seemingly abandoned, though smoke still rose from the chimney. After repeated knocking went unanswered, the group departed, but not before one member claimed to have seen a face, white as bone and just as rigid, watching from an upstairs window. This witness, a deacon in the local church named Harold Wilson, later elaborated in a statement to the sheriff. It wasn't natural, the stillness of that face. No blinking, no movement at all. And the eyes. I've looked into the eyes of dying men and seen less emptiness. Whatever watched us from that window, I cannot bring myself to believe it was human, at least not any longer. On our return journey, I found myself overcome with the conviction that we were being followed, though when I turned, the road behind us was empty. That night, my wife reported hearing scratching at our bedroom window, though we sleep on the second floor, with no tree or structure nearby that would allow someone to reach it. For several months, activity at the Blackwood property appeared to cease entirely. No smoke rose from the chimney, and no movement was observed. Yet, strangely, the garden continued to thrive, with plants growing in what witnesses described as unnatural abundance despite apparent neglect. This peculiarity was noted by several townspeople who, emboldened by the sisters' apparent absence, ventured close enough to observe the property from a distance. One such observer, a woman named Martha Collins, reported in a letter to her sister in Denver, later donated to the Colorado Historical Society by Collins's descendants. The garden flourishes as if tended by invisible hands. Vines that should wither in frost climb the walls with vigor, bearing flowers of unusual hue, deep purples and blues not commonly seen in cultivated plants. Most strange are the patterns in which they grow, forming what appear to be deliberate shapes along the eastern wall of the cabin. From certain angles, these configurations resemble script, not English letters, but something more akin to the ancient writing one sees in biblical illustrations. It was during this period of apparent abandonment that reports of strange phenomena near the eastern boundary increased dramatically. Cattle refused to graze within a quarter-mile of the area. Birds were noticeably absent from the vicinity. Most significantly, travelers reported intense feelings of dread and disorientation when passing nearby, particularly after sunset. Several accounts describe an inexplicable sound, variously characterized as humming, whispering, or the creaking of a great wheel, emanating from somewhere in the vicinity. A stagecoach driver named Patrick Donovan, who regularly traveled the route past the Blackwood property, provided a detailed account of these phenomena in an interview with the Rocky Mountain News correspondent. According to the article, published on September 10, 1866, Donovan claimed that passengers frequently reported hearing voices calling their names as the coach passed a particular stretch of road near the foothills. "It's always worst around dusk," Donovan stated. "Something about the light going, but not quite gone. I've had grown men, hardened miners and the like, reduced to tears for no reason they can name, women clutching their crucifixes and children hiding their faces. The horses feel it too, lathered with sweat, though we've barely climbed any grade to speak of. Twice now I've had a team bolt, driven by some fear I cannot see, but surely feel scraping at the back of my mind." In October of 1866, the situation escalated dramatically. Three young men from Conejos, emboldened by alcohol and dared by their peers, set out to investigate the now notorious well site. Only one, James Findlay, returned to town the following morning. According to the sheriff's report, Findlay was in a state of extreme agitation, his clothes torn and soiled. He claimed that upon approaching the well, his companions, Robert Jeffries and William Hayes, had insisted on lowering Jeffries into the structure using ropes they had brought for this purpose. Findlay's account, recorded in the sheriff's log, stated that as Jeffries descended, he initially called up regular reports. The well was dry, the walls were inscribed with unusual markings. There appeared to be a tunnel or opening at the bottom. Then, approximately 15 feet down, Jeffries fell silent for several seconds before emitting a scream unlike anything human. The rope they were holding allegedly went slack, then taut, then began to vibrate violently. When Hayes leaned over the edge to look, Findlay claimed something. He could not or would not specify what, pulled Hayes into the darkness below. It wasn't a hand, Findlay insisted, according to the transcription of his statement. Nothing so defined as that. More like, God help me for saying it, more like a mass of reaching shadows, but solid enough to grasp a man's shoulders and pull him down with such force that his boots left marks where they scraped the edge of the well. There was a sound, too, not the scream, which had stopped by then, but a sort of satisfied exhalation, like a predator that seized its prey. I ran. May God forgive me, but I ran, and didn't look back. But I could hear it following, not footsteps, but a kind of rustling movement through the undergrowth, keeping pace. It only stopped when I reached the edge of town, as if something prevented it from coming closer to where people live and worship. Findlay fled back to town, his story meeting with initial skepticism. A search party was organized the following day, but upon reaching the site, they found no trace of the missing men or the ropes. The well itself, now examined in daylight by multiple witnesses, was described as a circular stone structure, approximately 12 feet in diameter and of undetermined depth. Attempts to illuminate the interior proved largely unsuccessful, as lantern light seemed to be absorbed by an unusual darkness within. Most disturbing was the discovery, reported by 3 separate members of the search party, of what appeared to be fresh mortar between certain stones near the top of the structure, suggesting recent modifications or repairs. This mortar, when examined, contained unusual inclusions, small fragments of what one member of the party, a former army surgeon, believed to be bone, though of what type or origin he could not determine with certainty. When asked directly if he believed Findlay's account, Sheriff Thomas Wilkes was recorded as saying, "I believe something happened to those boys. Whether it was what Findlay claims or something more mundane, perhaps a drunken accident, followed by panic, I cannot say. But there is something unwholesome about that place, something that sets a man's teeth on edge. In 23 years of law enforcement, both here and in the East, I have developed what some might call an instinct for wrongness. That, well, it's wrong in a way I cannot articulate, but nevertheless recognize." In the aftermath of the October incident, the territorial governor dispatched an investigator from Denver to assess the situation. Howard Brackley arrived in Conejos on November 12, 1866, and spent 3 days interviewing locals and examining records before visiting the well site himself. His official report, filed on November 18th, dismissed most of the more sensational claims as frontier superstition exacerbated by isolation and limited education. He attributed the disappearances to normal frontier hazards, exposure, animal attacks, or possibly criminal activity unrelated to the Blackwood sisters. Brackley's report contained detailed measurements and observations of the well structure, which he determined to be approximately 40 feet deep, though he noted that his measuring line encountered an obstruction that prevented him from ascertaining the exact depth. He described the markings on the interior walls as tool marks consistent with the excavation methods common to mining operations in the territory, rather than the symbolic inscriptions reported by previous observers. Regarding the well itself, Brackley wrote, The structure appears to be a failed attempt at a water well, likely abandoned when no aquifer was struck. Its unusual depth and construction may be attributed to European mining techniques brought west by immigrants. The markings reported on the interior walls are merely tool marks and natural erosion patterns. I recommend the structure be filled in to prevent further accidents and to dispel the growing folklore surrounding it. What Brackley's report failed to explain, however, was the sudden reappearance of the Blackwood sisters in town on November 15th, the same day he conducted his examination of the well. According to multiple witnesses, both sisters arrived at the Mercantile in the late afternoon, appearing thin but otherwise healthy. They purchased substantial supplies: flour, coffee, salt, ammunition, and several yards of black cloth. Constance inquired about recent events in town and seemed particularly interested in whether any government men had visited recently. The Mercantile owner, still grieving the loss of his wife earlier that year, reported that the sisters' appearance had changed subtly but significantly. Most notably, he observed that the sisters moved with unusual synchronicity, their gestures and expressions mirroring each other in a manner he found more suited to twins than siblings born years apart. When the Mercantile owner mentioned Brackley's investigation, witnesses reported that Millicent, who had previously been silent, laughed in a manner described as harsh and discordant. According to one account, she then spoke directly to her sister, saying, "He will understand soon. Enough." Constance reportedly quieted her with a sharp glance before completing their transaction. Constance, always reserved, now displayed what he described as an unnerving serenity, as if privy to some profound secret. Millicent, previously gaunt and withdrawn, appeared to have gained weight and vigor, though her pallor remained pronounced. Before departing, Constance left several vials of her herbal remedies as gifts for certain townspeople, including Sheriff Wilkes and the widow of the recently deceased town doctor. These gestures, previously commonplace, now took on a more ominous significance in light of recent events. The sheriff later reported having discarded his vial unopened, while the doctor's widow claimed to have used the remedy for her rheumatism with remarkable results, though she subsequently complained of increasingly vivid and disturbing dreams. Brackley departed Conejos on November 17th, apparently satisfied that the matter had been resolved. His stagecoach arrived in Denver on schedule, but Brackley himself was not aboard. The driver reported that Brackley had exited during a brief stop approximately 20 miles outside Conejos, claiming he needed to verify a detail for his report and would catch the next stage. According to the driver's statement, preserved in the territorial records, Brackley appeared agitated and mentioned having forgotten to examine something called the aperture. No subsequent stage reported his presence, and Brackley was never seen again. A search of his Denver office, conducted in December when concerns about his continued absence were raised, revealed a half-completed letter to the territorial governor expressing his intention to recommend a more thorough investigation of the well site. The letter contained a passage not included in his official report. Upon further reflection, I find myself troubled by certain inconsistencies in my observations. The structure's depth and construction suggest a purpose beyond water acquisition, particularly given the known aquifer depths in the region. The absence of debris or silt at the bottom is inconsistent with abandonment. Most concerning is the acoustic anomaly I experienced, a phenomenon I initially attributed to wind currents, but now believe may indicate the presence of a larger subterranean structure connected to the well shaft. Following Brackley's disappearance, the territorial governor considered sending a military detachment to investigate, but pressing matters related to indigenous conflicts further north diverted attention from the Conejos situation. Winter descended on the San Luis Valley, isolating the settlement and temporarily suspending official interest in the Blackwood sisters and the well. It was during this winter that the most detailed account of the well's interior was recorded. In January 1867, a trapper named Ethan Cordley sought shelter at the Blackwood cabin during a blizzard. Unlike previous visitors, Cordley was invited to stay for several days as the storm persisted. During this time, he later claimed he gained the sisters' trust by sharing medicinal knowledge he had acquired from various indigenous peoples during his travels. Cordley's account, recorded by a Denver newspaper in March 1867, after he had relocated to the city, described the interior of the cabin as austere but meticulously maintained. The rear portion of the dwelling, previously off-limits to visitors, contained what Cordley described as a workshop of sorts, with dried plants hanging from the rafters, numerous glass containers of powders and liquids, and several large leather-bound volumes in languages he could not identify. The books were the most curious items, Cordley stated in his interview, bound in leather that had an unusual texture, not quite like any animal hide I've encountered in 20 years of trapping. The pages were thin, yet remarkably durable, with a slight translucence that reminded me of certain fungi I've observed growing on deadwood after prolonged rain. The text was written in a script unlike any I've seen, though certain symbols recurred with a frequency suggesting common linguistic elements. What struck me most was the precision of the writing, each character identical to its repetitions, as if stamped rather than handwritten, yet with a fluidity of line that no mechanical process could achieve. Most significantly, Cordley claimed that on his third night, after sharing a meal that included a peculiar tea which left him feeling uncommonly lucid, the sisters led him to the well. His description of the journey suggests the structure was farther from the cabin than previously believed, approximately a mile east, in a slight depression surrounded by unusual rock formations. The path they followed, according to Cordley, was not visible to the casual observer, but was marked by subtle alterations to the natural landscape, stones arranged in particular patterns, trees with specific branches removed, patches of earth where the snow melted more rapidly than surrounding areas. He noted that as they approached the well site, Constance recited what seemed to be a formula or incantation, though in a voice too low for him to discern the words. Millicent, walking slightly behind, made responsive sounds at regular intervals, creating what Cordley described as a rhythm that seemed to alter our perception of time, such that what I believe to have been a journey of at least an hour passed with the subjective experience of mere minutes. According to Cordley, the well was accessed via a narrow path that wound between two large boulders. The interior, which he was permitted to view but expressly forbidden from entering, descended well beyond the reach of lantern light. The walls were indeed marked with symbols, which Cordley, unlike previous observers, did not attribute to tool marks but rather described as deliberate inscriptions, similar in form to certain Anasazi petroglyphs I have observed, yet distinct in their precision and depth. The symbols appeared to spiral downward, Cordley elaborated, becoming more complex as they descended. The structure itself rose approximately 4 feet above ground level, with a low stone wall encircling it. Those nearest the surface contained primarily geometric elements, circles, triangles, and lines, arranged in patterns suggesting a mathematical progression. Further down, these gave way to more elaborate configurations that reminded me of anatomical illustrations I once observed in a medical text, though depicting structures unknown to human physiology. The sisters referred to these markings as the correspondence, though whether this indicated communication, correlation, or some other relationship, I cannot say. Most disturbing was Cordley's claim that while standing at the edge of the well, he became aware of what he described as a presence rising from below, not a physical entity, but rather a concentration of attention, as palpable as a change in air pressure. According to his account, Millicent then produced a small cloth bundle from her pocket, unwrapped it to reveal what appeared to be a fragment of bone, and dropped it into the darkness below. Cordley reported hearing not the expected clatter of the fragment hitting bottom, but rather a sound like many small stones falling simultaneously, followed by what I can only describe as an exhalation of enormous volume. The air changed after that, he continued, became heavier, charged with something akin to the aftermath of lightning. Constance began to speak, not to me, nor to her sister, but to the well itself. Her words were in that same unknown language I had observed in their books. What followed was the most disturbing aspect of the encounter, a response from the depth, a voice that seemed both singular and plural simultaneously, with tonal qualities suggesting multiple speakers whose words aligned with uncanny precision. The exchange continued for perhaps 5 minutes, during which Millicent maintained a posture of such rigid attention that she appeared almost cataleptic. When the voice finally subsided, both sisters exhibited signs of extreme fatigue, as if the conversation had depleted some vital energy. Constance allegedly explained to Cordley that the well was a doorway or speaking tube, accounts vary, that had been discovered shortly after their arrival in the valley. She claimed the structure predated European settlement by centuries and had been used by indigenous peoples for purposes she would not specify. Most significantly, she allegedly told Cordley that the well demanded offerings, and that, in exchange, it shared knowledge from the other side of the world. When pressed on the nature of these offerings, Constance reportedly became evasive, stating only that the well preferred substances that had once housed consciousness. Cordley interpreted this to mean organic materials of human or animal origin, though he noted that the bone fragment he had observed appeared to be human, possibly a phalanx or small carpal bone. According to Cordley, Constance further explained that she and her sister had been called to the San Luis Valley by dreams that began shortly after their father's death, dreams featuring a circular stone structure and voices speaking in the language he had heard during the well exchange. Their journey west had been motivated not by financial necessity, as was commonly believed, but by what Constance described as an obligation to resume the correspondence that had been interrupted. Cordley's account was largely dismissed as the fabrication of a man seeking notoriety, particularly when subsequent investigation revealed his history of alcohol abuse and previous publication of dubious frontier tales. Nevertheless, his description of the well's location and appearance contained details that aligned with the few official reports available, and certain elements, particularly his reference to the correspondence and substances that had once housed consciousness, echoed phrases found in fragments of the Blackwood documents that would later come to light. Of particular interest to later researchers was Cordley's claim that before his departure from the cabin, Millicent gifted him a small object which she instructed him to carry as protection against certain influences. This object, which he described as a disc of bone approximately the size of a silver dollar, inscribed with markings similar to those within the well, was allegedly stolen from his Denver lodgings shortly after the publication of his account. However, a detailed sketch of the disc, drawn by Cordley from memory, was preserved in the newspaper's archives and rediscovered in 1952. When examined by anthropologists, the symbols depicted in the sketch were identified as bearing similarities to certain Mississippian cultural artifacts dating from approximately 1200 CE, suggesting a possible connection to indigenous practices predating European contact. By spring of 1867, the Blackwood sisters had once again withdrawn from public view. Their cabin remained occupied, as evidenced by occasional smoke from the chimney, but neither sister was seen in town. Local sentiment had shifted from suspicion to outright fear, with many residents taking substantial detours to avoid passing near their property. Parents forbade children from venturing east of town, and it was reported that even the local indigenous population, primarily Ute and Hispanic settlers, avoided the area. A Methodist circuit preacher who visited Conejos during this period noted in his journal, "A pall hangs over this settlement unlike any I have encountered in my travels. The people speak in hushed tones of two women who dwell to the east, though none will name them directly. When I inquired about establishing a prayer meeting for those concerned about these matters, I was politely but firmly discouraged. Some things, the town elder told me, are better left undisturbed by prayer, a most troubling sentiment from those who profess Christian faith. It was during this period of heightened tension that Thomas Woodward, the surveyor mentioned at the beginning of our account, arrived in the region. Employed by the territorial government to map potential routes for a railway spur, Woodward was apparently unaware of the local concerns regarding the Blackwood property and the well. His initial report, filed in February 1868, makes no mention of either. It was only in his March addendum, the document discovered in 1962, that he referenced the structure. Woodward's addendum provides the most objective description of the well available. He described the structure as circular, approximately 12 feet in diameter, constructed of fitted stone without mortar, extending both above and below ground level. His attempt to measure the depth using a weighted line was apparently unsuccessful, as he reported that the weight appeared to reach bottom at approximately 37 feet, but upon retrieval, the line was found to be severed cleanly at 32 feet. Woodward's report included a detailed drawing of the well's construction, noting that the stones fit together with remarkable precision, particularly given the apparent age of the structure. He observed that certain stones contained incised markings, which he initially attributed to tool marks, but later described as arranged in patterns suggesting deliberate inscription. Most notably, he documented a recurring symbol that appeared at regular intervals around the inner circumference, a design resembling an elongated figure eight with small protrusions at the cardinal points. Most significantly, Woodward reported experiencing a peculiar atmospheric disturbance while working near the well, a sensation he described as similar to the pressure one feels in the ears during rapid changes in elevation, accompanied by an auditory effect reminiscent of distant voices. Being a man of science, Woodward attributed this phenomenon to unusual acoustic properties of the well's construction, combined with air currents from the mountains, though he noted that his assistant, he noted its precise location, approximately 5.8 miles east of Conejos, at the base of a small rise where the valley floor begins to ascend toward the mountains. Holloway was sufficiently disturbed by the experience to refuse to approach the structure a second time. Woodward concluded his addendum with a recommendation that the proposed railway route be adjusted to bypass the area containing the well, citing unusual geological instability as the justification. This adjustment would add approximately 3 miles to the route, but would avoid what Woodward described as a region of potentially hazardous subsidence. Later analysts have noted that this justification appears to have been a pretext, as Woodward's geological surveys of the area showed no evidence of the instability he claimed. What Woodward could not have known was that his visit to the well had apparently been observed. According to a statement later given by James Findlay, the sole survivor of the October 1866 incident, he had seen both Blackwood sisters watching Woodward from a distance as he conducted his measurements. Findlay, who had taken to monitoring the area from afar using a spyglass, claimed the sisters appeared agitated by the surveyor's presence and engaged in what he described as animated discourse while observing him. They stood approximately 200 yards from where Woodward worked, Findlay's statement reads, partially concealed by a stand of juniper. Their posture suggested alarm, frequent gesturing toward the well, and what appeared to be disagreement between them. At one point, the younger sister, Millicent, seemed prepared to approach Woodward directly, but was physically restrained by Constance. When Woodward and his assistant departed, the sisters remained for some time, examining the well from a distance before returning in the direction of their cabin. That evening, I observed unusual activity at their property, lights moving in patterns between the cabin and the direction of the well, continuing well past midnight. 3 days after filing his addendum, Woodward departed Conejos, ostensibly to continue his survey work further north. He checked into a hotel in Saguache on March 23, 1868, but never checked out. His room, when examined after several days of his absence, contained his personal effects and field notes, but showed no signs of disturbance. A leather-bound journal found among his belongings contained a final entry dated March 24th. Dreamt of the well last night. Voices calling from below, not in English, yet somehow comprehensible. They spoke my name and made reference to measurements and angles I had not yet calculated, but had intended to compute today. Most disturbing was their knowledge of private matters, my wife's illness, my son's military service. Upon waking, found a small object on the floor beside my bed that I am certain was not there when I retired. A fragment of what appears to be bone, carved with the same elongated figure 8 I observed within the well. Have secured it in my specimen case for further examination. The specimen case mentioned in Woodward's journal was not found among his belongings, and a search of the surrounding area yielded no trace of him. His disappearance was officially attributed to abandonment of post, and his name was struck from the Territorial Employment Records, a bureaucratic convenience that later researchers would note was common practice when government employees met with unexplained ends in the territories. It was Woodward's disappearance, following so closely after his documentation of the well, that finally prompted more decisive action from the territorial authorities. In April 1868, a detachment of 4 soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Robert Carson was dispatched to Conejos with orders to investigate the Blackwood property and the well site, and to detain the sisters for questioning regarding the various disappearances. Carson, a Civil War veteran with a distinguished record, approached the assignment with methodical thoroughness. His personal journal, later recovered among his effects, reveals his initial skepticism. Assigned to investigate superstitious nonsense about a well and 2 spinster women. The territory is rife with real threats, hostile indigenous bands, criminal elements displaced by the war, yet resources are diverted to placate the fears of isolated settlers. Will complete this task with appropriate diligence, but expect to find nothing more sinister than frontier paranoia magnified by isolation. The detachment arrived on April 17th and immediately proceeded to the Blackwood cabin. They found the dwelling unlocked and apparently abandoned, though evidence suggested recent occupation. Carson's report, preserved in the Colorado State Military Archives, describes the interior as meticulously organized, with no sign of hasty departure. The workshop area mentioned by Cordley contained empty shelves and hooks where items had clearly been removed. A trapdoor in the floor revealed a small cellar containing several crates of books and papers, which Carson ordered confiscated. Carson's journal provides additional details not included in his official report. The cellar contained an unusual apparatus, a glass vessel connected to a copper coil, reminiscent of distillation equipment, but with modifications suggesting a different purpose. Several of the glass containers held what appeared to be bone fragments suspended in a clear liquid. Most disturbing was the discovery of a hidden compartment beneath a false floor in the cellar, containing what I can only describe as human remains in various stages of processing. Cleaned bones sorted by type, others partially defleshed, still others apparently treated with some substance that rendered them unusually hard and slightly luminescent in darkness. The well site, which the detachment visited the following day, matched Woodward's description precisely. Carson ordered his men to illuminate the interior using a powerful signal lantern lowered on a metal chain. At approximately 30 feet of depth, the light revealed what Carson described as a horizontal opening or passage extending northward. Attempts to lower the lantern further resulted in the chain being seized by some force below and jerked with such violence that 2 men could scarcely maintain their grip. Carson's journal elaborates. The men reported a sensation as if the chain had been grasped and pulled deliberately rather than caught on some projection within the well. When they attempted to raise the lantern, they encountered significant resistance, as if something below maintained its grip. It was only after applying considerable force that they were able to retrieve the apparatus. When the lantern was retrieved, Carson reported that the glass was intact, but the flame had been extinguished. More disturbing was his observation that the metal of the chain and lantern had undergone an inexplicable transformation, appearing corroded and discolored in a manner suggesting exposure to caustic substances, though no residue was apparent. His journal adds, "The metal has a peculiar texture now, almost organic to the touch, like dried animal hide rather than iron. Several links show distinct impressions, as if squeezed by fingers of unusual strength, yet the overall pattern suggests multiple points of contact, rather than the grip of a single hand." Based on these findings, Carson ordered the well sealed. His men spent the remainder of April 18th gathering large rocks from the surrounding area and filling the structure. By nightfall, the well had been packed with stones to ground level and a wooden marker placed to warn travelers. Carson's final report indicates his intention to interrogate locals regarding the whereabouts of the Blackwood sisters, but subsequent documents suggest this investigation was never completed. Carson's journal contains a final entry, dated April 18th. "Completed the sealing of the well today, an arduous task that left the men exhausted but satisfied. Throughout the process, I experienced a persistent sensation of being observed, though repeated surveys of the surrounding area revealed no presence. As we worked, all 4 men reported hearing what they described as whispers emanating from the depths, though in a language none could identify. Most troubling was the behavior of the stones themselves. Several times we observed rocks shifting without apparent cause, as if the well resisted our efforts to seal it. Upon completion, I placed a marker and instructed the men to avoid the area after dark. Tonight I shall review the documents confiscated from the Blackwood cellar and prepare my report for territorial authorities. There is more to this matter than frontier superstition, though I hesitate to speculate without further evidence." On the morning of April 19th, the detachment awoke to find Lieutenant Carson missing from his quarters in the town's small hotel. A search revealed his uniform and weapons still in his room, but no sign of Carson himself. Of particular note was the discovery of a small glass vial on his bedside table, similar to those used by Constance Blackwood for her herbal remedies, though its contents had been consumed. Also found was a single sheet of paper containing what appeared to be a partial translation or transcription in Carson's handwriting, a series of phrases including "the aperture remains viable," "correspondence to resume pending sufficient accumulation," and "vessels required for transition." The 3 remaining soldiers, now leaderless and unnerved by Carson's disappearance, elected to return to Fort Garland rather than continue the investigation. They departed on April 20th, taking with them the crates of documents from the Blackwood cellar. These materials were logged into the fort's records upon their arrival, but subsequently vanished from the inventory during a reorganization in 1875. No copies or transcriptions have ever been located, with the exception of the single page found in Carson's room. In the aftermath of the military detachment's departure, Conejos settled into an uneasy calm. The Blackwood cabin remained abandoned, and no further sightings of the sisters were reported. The well, though ostensibly sealed, continued to be avoided by locals. Occasional travelers passing through the area reported that the wooden marker placed by Carson's men had been removed, and some claimed that the stones used to fill the well appeared to have been rearranged or partially cleared. A diary kept by a local woman, Maria Vasquez, contains an entry from June 1868 that suggests continued activity at the site. Juan returned from hunting today in a state of great disturbance. He had passed near the eastern hills where the well lies and observed what he described as 2 figures in dark clothing working at the stone circle. Thinking they might be the Blackwood women returned, he approached cautiously, but as he drew nearer, both figures turned to regard him simultaneously. He swears they had no faces, only smooth white ovals where features should be. He fled immediately, and will not be persuaded to hunt in that direction again. It was not until the spring of 1869 that the final chapter of the well's documented history unfolded. A geology professor from an eastern university, Dr. Edward Pierce, arrived in Conejos in May of that year, having read accounts of the well in territorial newspapers. Pierce represented himself as a scientific investigator interested in unusual geological formations. He hired 2 local men as guides and laborers and established a camp near the well site. Over the course of 2 weeks, Pierce conducted what he described in correspondence to colleagues as a systematic excavation and examination of the well. His letters, preserved in the archives of Hartford College, detail the removal of the stones placed by Carson's men and the insertion of a specially constructed observation platform approximately 20 feet into the shaft. The structure defies conventional explanation, Pierce wrote to a colleague on May 27, 1869. Its construction techniques suggest an origin predating European settlement, yet the precision of the stonework exceeds what we typically attribute to indigenous builders of the region. Most curious is the material itself. While appearing to be local stone, microscopic examination reveals unusual crystalline structures inconsistent with geological formations known to exist in this area. I am increasingly convinced that we are dealing with an artifact of significant archaeological importance, possibly representing a previously undocumented cultural tradition. Pierce's correspondence reveals his growing fascination with the inscriptions found within the well. In a letter dated May 30th, he wrote, "I have begun cataloging the symbols that spiral down the interior walls. They form a coherent system rather than random markings with recurring elements suggesting a developed script. Certain sequences appear at regular intervals, possibly demarcating sections or chapters in a larger text. The symbols bear superficial resemblance to Phoenician or Proto-Sinaitic scripts, yet contain elements wholly unfamiliar to me despite my background in comparative linguistics. Most intriguing is their three-dimensional quality. Many symbols appear to shift or change when viewed from different angles or under varying light conditions, suggesting multiple layers of meaning encoded within a single inscription." As his investigation progressed, Pierce's letters indicate increasing isolation from his hired assistants, whom he described as increasingly reluctant to enter the well structure and susceptible to superstitious fears that hamper scientific inquiry. By June 1st, he reported working alone within the well for extended periods, using a system of ropes and pulleys to lower himself into the shaft. He noted that the shaft descended vertically for approximately 40 feet, before opening into what he described as a chamber of considerable size, roughly circular, with a diameter of perhaps 20 feet. The walls of this chamber, according to Pierce, were covered with inscriptions similar to those in the shaft, which he identified as a form of Proto-Semitic script, though certain elements suggest influences from entirely separate linguistic traditions. The chamber appears to have been excavated with remarkable precision, Pierce wrote, its walls smooth and regular despite the hardness of the surrounding stone. Pierce's final letter, dated June 3, 1869, contains the most detailed description of the well's interior yet recorded. Most curious is the acoustic property of the space. Words spoken even in a whisper produce complex resonances that seem to emanate not from the walls, but from some point below the chamber floor. This phenomenon suggests the presence of additional spaces beyond what I have thus far been able to access. Most significantly, Pierce reported that the floor of the chamber was carpeted with bones, hundreds, perhaps thousands of individual fragments, primarily human, representing what I estimate to be dozens of individuals of varying ages. These bones, he noted, showed evidence of deliberate modification, scoring, carving, and in some cases reassembly into configurations that defy anatomical logic. The purpose of these modifications eludes me, he continued, though they suggest ritualistic rather than practical intent. Many bones bear inscriptions similar to those on the chamber walls, but executed with extraordinary delicacy. The grooves no wider than a human hair, yet precisely formed. Others have been joined together using a substance I cannot identify, neither adhesive nor metal, but possessing properties of both. When struck, these assemblages produce tones of unusual purity and duration, which appear to excite sympathetic vibrations within the chamber itself. Pierce's letter expressed his intention to descend fully into the chamber the following day, accompanied by one of his hired men. He planned to conduct acoustic experiments using several of the bone assemblages, which he believed might reveal the purpose for which this remarkable structure was created. He requested that should his colleague not hear from him within 1 month, an expedition should be organized to continue his work, as he believed he was on the verge of a discovery that will revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian cultures in North America. No further correspondence was ever received from Pierce. When concerned colleagues telegraphed the sheriff in Conejos in late July, a search party was dispatched to Pierce's camp. They found it abandoned, with equipment and personal belongings still in the tents. The well itself appeared undisturbed, with Pierce's observation platform still in place at the 20-foot mark. There was no sign of Pierce or his assistants. The search party, unnerved by the disappearances and the growing legend surrounding the well, made no attempt to descend further. Instead, they once again filled the shaft with stones, this time adding a mixture of lime and clay between layers in an attempt to create a more permanent seal. Before departing, one member of the party, a local rancher named Tobias Sullivan, reportedly placed a crude wooden cross atop the filled well. The sheriff's report of the incident, dated August 3, 1869, contains a curious detail not found in other accounts. Upon completing the filling of the well, all members of the search party reported experiencing a pronounced sensation of relief, as if a pressure or presence had been removed. This was followed approximately 30 minutes later by a tremor or vibration that several witnesses compared to a distant explosion, though no sound accompanied it. This disturbance appeared to emanate from the well site itself, causing the newly placed stones to settle somewhat. No further anomalous phenomena were observed, and the party returned to town without incident. In the months that followed, settlers in the region increasingly avoided the area around the well. By autumn of 1869, a local ordinance had been passed prohibiting travel east of town without specific permission from the sheriff. The Blackwood property was declared abandoned and reverted to territorial ownership, though no attempts were made to sell or develop it. The final documented mention of the well from this period appears in the diary of Reverend Jonathan Marsh, who served as circuit preacher for the region from 1867 to 1871. In an entry dated November 12, 1869, Marsh wrote, "Rode past the site they call the Sisters' Well today, felt compelled to stop and offer prayers for those lost. The cross placed by Sullivan has been removed, and the ground appears disturbed, though no one admits to having visited the place. As I prayed, I became aware of a subtle vibration through the soles of my boots, as though something far below was in motion. The sensation persisted until I mounted my horse and rode well away. I shall not return to that unhallowed ground." Marsh's entry continues with an observation that many later researchers have found significant. "Met a woman on the road back to town, who I initially took to be a stranger passing through, tall, severe in aspect, wearing clothing of Eastern cut, though weathered by travel. She inquired about the well site with particular interest in whether anyone still visited it. When I mentioned the disappearances associated with the place, she smiled in a manner I can only describe as knowing. It was then I realized she bore a striking resemblance to Constance Blackwood, though somewhat altered, her face thinner, her eyes deeper set. Before I could inquire further, she thanked me for my information and continued eastward. I later learned no stranger had been seen entering town from that direction. nor had anyone encountered such a woman on the main road. I find myself troubled by the encounter, particularly by the woman's parting words. The correspondence continues elsewhere now. This junction has served its purpose. With Marsh's entry, the contemporary documentation of the well effectively ends. The Blackwood sisters were never seen again, though rumors occasionally surfaced of two women matching their description in various settlements throughout the West. None of these sightings were ever confirmed, though a report filed by a Utah territorial marshal in 1872 described the arrest of two women suspected of grave robbery in a small mining community. The women, who gave their names as Catherine and Margaret Wells, were released when no evidence could be produced and subsequently vanished from the area. The marshal's description of the suspects bears certain similarities to the Blackwood sisters, though he noted that both women appeared considerably younger than their manner of speech would suggest. The well itself faded into local legend, its exact location becoming increasingly uncertain as the landscape changed through natural processes and human development. By the turn of the century, the story of the sisters' well had become a cautionary tale told to children. A frontier bogeyman used to discourage wandering too far from town. It was not until 1962, with the discovery of Woodward's addendum in the Colorado State Archives, that scholarly interest in the well was briefly revived. A graduate student named Michael Reynolds attempted to locate the site based on Woodward's coordinates, but the landscape had changed significantly, and his search proved fruitless. Reynolds did, however, interview several elderly residents of the region who recalled stories of the well from their youth. One such resident, Maria Vasquez, who was 93 at the time of her interview, claimed that her grandmother had known Constance Blackwood personally. According to Vasquez, her grandmother described Constance as a woman with knowledge beyond her years who spoke of places beneath the earth where voices could be heard from the other side of the world. More disturbing was Vasquez's claim that her grandmother had once been given a protective charm by Constance, a small cloth pouch containing what appeared to be a fragment of human bone. In her final years, she spoke often of dreams in which she visited a circular stone chamber and conversed with beings she described as neither human nor spirit, but something in between. She believed these dreams were connected to the charm, which disappeared from her possessions after her death, though none of the family admitted to taking it. Reynolds's research culminated in a thesis titled Folklore and Fact: The Well of the Sisters' Bones in Historical Context, completed in 1963 but never published. My grandmother carried it always, Vasquez told Reynolds, and credited it with her unusual longevity. She lived to 102, despite the hardships of frontier life. The manuscript preserved in the University of Colorado archives concludes that while the well likely existed as a physical structure, most of the supernatural elements associated with it were elaborations born of frontier isolation and the human tendency to mythologize the unexplained. Reynolds himself seems to have been satisfied with this rational explanation, though a curious note appears in the university records indicating that he abandoned a planned follow-up study and changed his academic focus entirely following a research trip to the San Luis Valley in the summer of 1964. No explanation for this change was ever documented, though a colleague later recalled that Reynolds had returned from this trip noticeably altered in demeanor, withdrawn and reluctant to discuss his findings. Reynolds subsequently left academia entirely, relocating to a remote area of Maine, where he reportedly lived as something of a recluse until his death in 1997. In the decades since, the story of the Well of the Sisters' Bones has remained a footnote in Colorado's frontier history, occasionally referenced in collections of Western folklore or regional ghost stories, but largely forgotten by serious historians. The exact location of the well, if indeed any trace of it remains, has never been conclusively identified. Yet, even today, residents of the San Luis Valley occasionally report unusual experiences in the area east of what was once Conejos. Sensations of being watched, inexplicable sounds carried on the wind, and most commonly, dreams of two women in black walking toward the mountains, carrying lanterns that cast no light. Perhaps most disturbing are the occasional reports from hikers and hunters in the foothills of small cairns of stones appearing overnight. Circular arrangements surrounding deep holes that seem to have been excavated with care. Local authorities attribute these structures to natural processes or the work of pranksters familiar with the old legends. But those who know the story of the Blackwood sisters and their well might be forgiven for giving such places a wide berth, particularly as the sun begins to set and the shadows from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, the Blood of Christ Mountains, stretch across the valley like reaching fingers. In 1968, exactly 100 years after Woodward's initial documentation of the well, the last known researcher to seriously investigate the case, Dr. Eleanor Simmons of the University of Denver, summarized the story's enduring power in a lecture to the Colorado Historical Society. What makes the tale of the sisters' well so persistently unsettling is not the possibility that it was a portal to somewhere else, but rather the suggestion that whatever came through, whatever the sisters found or called or became, might still be moving among us, patient and purposeful, even now. During her research, Simmons discovered a curious pattern of disappearances spanning the century since the original incidents, cases where individuals investigating or expressing interest in the well subsequently vanished under mysterious circumstances. While many of these disappearances could be attributed to mundane causes, Simmons noted that several involved the discovery of small bone fragments at the last known location of the missing person, often inscribed with markings similar to those described in the historical accounts. Most notably, Simmons uncovered a series of surveyors' reports from the 1920s, when the region was being mapped for potential oil exploration. 3 separate teams reported discovering circular stone structures in the foothills east of what had once been Conejos, only to find the structures seemingly vanished when they returned with additional personnel. One surveyor's field journal, recovered after he failed to return from a solo expedition in 1924, contained the unsettling notation, "It moves." The structure is not fixed in location, but appears where it wishes to be found, by whom it wishes to find it. The case file on the Well of the Sisters' Bones was officially closed in 1969 and consigned to the Historical Archives. No formal investigation has been conducted since. But in certain academic circles, the case is still discussed in hushed tones, not as a frontier legend or cautionary tale, but as something else entirely, an inconvenient reminder that some depths, once opened, may never truly be sealed again. And if you find yourself traveling through southern Colorado, in that vast valley that stretches between mountain ranges like an ancient seabed, you might notice how locals still hesitate when asked about certain places east of town, places where the ground sometimes trembles without cause, and where on quiet nights the wind carries sounds that might be voices, calling from very far away or from somewhere much, much closer than we care to imagine. Some say that if you listen carefully enough, you might hear what sounds like 2 women engaged in conversation, their words indistinct, but their rhythm unmistakable, like sisters who have spoken together for so long they've developed their own language. And beneath their dialogue, barely perceptible, a third voice responding, a voice that, as one elderly resident put it, speaks words that were never meant for human ears, in a tone that was never shaped by human breath. The Blackwood sisters may be gone, but what they found, or what found them, remains patient and persistent, waiting for someone else curious enough or desperate enough to listen for voices from the well, to resume what the sisters' journal reportedly called the correspondence between worlds, as Dr. Simmons noted in her final assessment of the case. The most disturbing aspect of the Well of the Sisters' Bones is not what we know about it, but what we don't, and what that absence suggests about the limitations of our understanding. If even a fraction of the historical accounts are accurate, then somewhere in the San Luis Valley lies evidence of something that fundamentally challenges our conception of reality. The fact that such evidence remains elusive may be less a failure of investigation than a deliberate consequence of whatever intelligence orchestrated these events, a consciousness capable of concealing itself not merely from our perception, but from our very framework of comprehension. In 1968, shortly before the case was officially closed, a geological survey of the region detected an unusual seismic anomaly in the approximate vicinity of the well site. A cavity or chamber approximately 40 feet below ground level with dimensions roughly corresponding to Pierce's description. Plans to investigate further were abandoned when the survey team's equipment malfunctioned inexplicably, and subsequent attempts to relocate the anomaly proved unsuccessful. The final word on the Well of the Sisters' bones perhaps belongs to Thomas Woodward, whose discovery began the documented history of this disturbing case. In a personal letter to his wife, sent the day before his disappearance, and found among her effects after her death in 1890, Woodward wrote, "I believe I have encountered something for which our language, perhaps our very mode of thought, lacks adequate expression. It is not merely that I cannot describe what I have found, but that the finding itself has changed me in ways I struggle to comprehend. I dream now of depths and correspondences, of voices that speak without sound, and presences that exist without form. Most troubling is the sense that something answered when I hadn't realized I was calling, something that now regards me with terrible recognition, as if it has known me all along, has merely been waiting for me to notice its gaze. Should I not return, know that I went willingly toward understanding, though I fear the price of such knowledge may be higher than I imagined."